Wait, Matt Lyteson, CIO, Vice President of Technology Platform Transformation? That sounds a lot like my job. What are we both doing here?
Yeah, and did you hear the one where two CIOs walk into a bar and only one comes out? That's not what this is.
We got some work to do if that is the answer. All right, let's get into it. All that and more on today's episode of Transformers. We're going behind the scenes and screens with CIOs, CTOs, and other transformational technical leaders to learn what it takes to do their job, what it takes to succeed, and, more importantly, what makes them human at the end of the day. My name is Ann Funai. I'm CIO and Vice President of Business Platform Transformation at IBM, and this is Transformers, a Think podcast. So, Matt, I just said my title. Why don't you tell everybody what your title is too?
That was a great opening, by the way. So I'm Matt Lyteson, CIO, VP of Technology Platforms Transformation here at IBM.
So, maybe this is the moment we should kind of explain the difference between our jobs and maybe a little bit of how we got to this place. Do you want to start with your job or you want me to start with mine here?
Why don't you start with yours? And at least this isn't one of those awkward conversations where you walk into a party and you find out that someone literally has the same job as yours.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, it is a real thing potentially for us.
Yes.
So the way I would describe my job is I am responsible for the platforms we need to run our company. So think of the big SAPs, the Salesforces, the Adobes. It is what we need to create an experience for our customer, help our sellers sell, help our finance teams close the books, realize revenue, all of that stuff we need to do a job at IBM.
Yeah, and that sounds like a business platform to me, at least for my world. And
I mean, I hope so. It's my title.
Yeah, I get to do everything else, and technology platforms are kind of underneath everything that you're trying to do because you're also trying to change the business processes and fundamentally the way that the company operates, which is super exciting. And I think in order to do that and move as fast as we're trying to move, you got to be able to do it in parallel. And so that's where the technology platforms, where we do everything from our hybrid cloud environment to our AI platform so we can do that at scale, to things like our network and our productivity services. Radical transformation to get to best in class needs to happen simultaneously with the business platform transformation that you're driving. And so I think it's nice and complementary to the way that we are put in these positions to be able to operate and drive this type of radical change.
Oh, yeah. No, and I actually found it fascinating. And I think, you're the technology everybody needs, the technology that the company needs and we use, right? And what I think has been really fascinating, though, is, this kind of divide, we're seeing other companies do this. We're seeing it happen, in other spots in the industry. The divide between the two of them, I think, we've said it's a good thing we get along. It's a good thing we see eye to eye, but we also push each other. Is that part of why this is working for us and for IBM?
Well, I think so. And it's kind of interesting. I think right before, or pretty close before to when we got named into these roles, and we're kind of like, oh, this is interesting. I had heard some podcasts that were talking about this co-CIO model. And I think there's different perspectives out there, but a couple of the takeaways that really resonated with me, and even now retrospectively, is that understanding what the roles are. And I think you and I have a clear understanding of where our roles are, where we've got to partner together, where we complement, and where we've got our own clear direction and lanes to be able to drive at the rate and pace that we need to. That's extremely important. And then also being able to have an effective working relationship. And that means, as you said, sometimes we see eye to eye on things. Sometimes we've got to push each other and challenge. And then also have the ability to say, there's something interesting going on here. Let's kind of put two heads together, because two brains, in my opinion, are much better than a single brain. I think it's really important.
No, and I think one of the things that's been fun working with you is we're both very passionate about technology. I think we're both nerds to the core, but we have different I think we have different leading personality traits. And I think that's what makes our relationship fun too, is you definitely fill in some of my gaps. I feel like I fill in some of your gaps, and it's just become so complimentary. Like I give you credit, like I think you even know this about yourself. You can take in, absorb, and spit back out data almost faster than anyone I've ever seen. It's incredible. So,
And you get down into the weeds of some of these platform implementations like it's nobody's business. And the minutiae, especially for an organization that's driving the amount of strategic implementations and just the sheer size and magnitude of the change, to be able to be at a leader at your level, be responsible for all that, and dive down into that. I mean, you really tackle that head on, and you know all the answers about where everything is. You're going through a big implementation right now, and you know exactly where that is on pretty much every single day. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting to see how we've got these strengths that we can bring and help to raise the bar on each other. And I think also amongst our peer group within the broader organization. But I think also, to me, it really represents what you expect or what you would hope for. Most people would hope for what a good working relationship is. And I think just as in any relationship, you're going to have ups and downs, but really knowing where that is so that you aren't, you've probably worked in positions where you like, so there's a target on your back or whatever, and you don't get along with that person and you're at odds because you're kind of co-competing for the next job. I think we don't have any of that, which I think makes it effective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the job. I used to joke those were the jobs that you walk home and you're like, how many knives are on my back today? Like,
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
like, there's just none of that. And that's, I mean, I so enjoy working with you. And I think, again, I hope, like you said, we're rising the tide together.
Well, I think that's an example for me of something that, early on in my career, I didn't appreciate. It's kind of like you're developing code, and I think we were both there, then doing some architecture stuff. I certainly started off in the software space and consulting with clients and getting to know their business operations. And then at some point, there's this pivot in your career where you're like, oh yeah, you are going to work with people who maybe aren't as forthright, maybe they're hiding stuff for you. And at least for me, it took me a while to acknowledge that. But I don't think you typically get a coach who's going to tell you to watch out for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what's one of our running jokes is you have one emotion, I have two emotions, right? Like one of the things we want to do with this podcast is really talk a little bit about the humanity of our roles. And I recognizing I did make the joke just a moment ago about the lack of emotions between us, but yeah, there's a humanity here to it. And I think one of the things I've loved throughout my career, meeting other technical leaders, building the relationships, is really the vast diversity of experiences they grew up in, how they got to where they're at. And I think the fun fact about you is that you were actually a music major in school, and that's a hard pivot. But I think you had the passion for the IT there all the time. Would love for you to share about the journey. How did you end up here?
I think it's like, and I've got kids that are not quite to high school age yet. It's like, how can you know when you're 18, 19, 20 what you want to do for the rest of your life? And I did have an advisor in college. He was a music major as well. He had a PhD in music. And then I worked for him doing IT stuff on some AS400 boxes that our company made at the time, and writing programs. I enjoyed doing it, but it was kind of interesting because he was responsible for the institutional research department at the university. And it always stuck with me that college is where you go to learn how to learn.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
And I think it comes down to that. So I learned how to learn. I've always been an avid learner. And then I decided, okay, what's interesting for me now? And for one reason or another, end up on a path. And I still love to learn. I still love to, play around with music in sort of more of a hobbyish way. But I think, looking back on it, like, what do you want to learn next? And I still coach people on this, or like, what do I got to do to get my career advancement? I'm like, if you aren't clear on what you want to learn next, even stepping into this role, I was like, okay, here's the couple things that I want to learn. Am I going to be in a position to learn those things with this new opportunity? I imagine you went on a similar path coming back here as well.
Yeah, and I think two reactions to that. So one, and I think this is kind of one of the premises, that I'm bringing to this podcast, is I have a firm belief that you're never the smartest person in any room. And any room you walk into, there's someone who knows more about something than you do. And that kind of excitement, that seeking knowledge, that learning. And maybe it's not even about like tech or being a CIO or about a business platform. It's like, I think, we shared at one point, I enjoyed music, soccer, and computer science going into college.
Yeah.
And I had to pick two because in the 90s, I didn't have laptops. That means if you're going to computer science major, you're living in a lab. And it's like you make those choices, but there's this commonality between us and this different path. It's almost like we have each other's path not taken, and we ended up in the same place in a weird way. And that to me is always fascinating, folks, how they came to be where they're at. And it's interesting the way you said, at 18, 19, do we really know what we want to do? It's like some people are very fortunate enough to do it. I was kind of the one I knew I wanted to be a computer science person. I knew I wanted to work in tech. But I had what I called during college, I look back on and called the trough of discontentment, is I started as a computer science major and I ended as a computer science major. But in the middle, I had the whole crisis of like, oh my God, did I pick the right thing? Did I do oh my God, what did I do? Is this, and I think I tried once, there's a 2-semester period. I maybe was like, I'm going to major in 5 different other things. And I don't know if this computer science thing is right, but it's, I started and ended there. And, that is, great choice for me, but yeah.
Yeah, I kind of like that because it sounds like you had a couple different options between athletics, music, computer science. You kind of figured out what you want to do. Yeah, you question it,
Yeah.
late teens, early 20s, and then you settled on it. I think we
Yeah.
need people, and it's awesome to work with people like that. I've always bumped across them in my career. They're like, yeah, even to the point of, yes, I've always wanted to work for this company, since I was a teenager for one reason or another, which is great. I just have not been like that. And I like to say I'm still figuring out what I want to do when I grow up.
Oh, no. Yeah. I mean, who knows? I mean, I'm probably going to be on a ranch, fixing car engines or something like that 20 years from now, or you're running a little shop or working, who knows, maybe I'll be working at a wine bar. This really could go anyway.
Or a wine bar with an auto body shop next to it.
Can I take that idea right now, or do I have to share the proceeds with you? The other direction I want to take you is, what are really benchmarks, what the differences are? Because I think one of the really interesting things that we've found as we're going through budgets and financials is that, there are benchmarks and things in each of our areas, but they're driven in very different ways. So benchmarks are something you and I believe so heavily in, and it's something we're grounding so many of our organizational and operational decisions in. Would love for you to talk about some of the benchmarks in the IT space that you have.
Well, I think it all comes back in trying to level set on what does good look like. And how do I know what good is? I've been part of IT organizations for a number of years that talk about, hey, we want to be the best IT organization. There's some awards that are outside for that. But how do you really know? And I think benchmarking is one way to start level setting yourself and say, okay, if I'm running a race, for example, a 100-meter race, I know what good looks like. I know what best in the world looks like. I also know what good looks like. So you start asking your question, how do I know what good looks like? And of course, there's the financial metrics on that, but you soon realize that financial metrics are insufficient if you need to sustain an operation. I like to give the example of, hey, we want to get the lowest cost in what we're paying for our devices and our digital employee experience, which includes all the software that's on the devices and how we do IT support. It's like, well, I can tell you I can get to the lowest cost. It's like, I'm going to give you a device that you probably will be unhappy with and won't be able to do your job if you're an engineer or a developer. And so then you start to ask yourself, well, what are the balancing factors? And start to drive after. I like to call it cost performance, something like that. But it's really that value dimension that is outside of the cost metric that you need to figure out what those are in each of the services. And when you think about services, we use the technology business management approach, which has a nice taxonomy, which allows you to compare different things. You start asking yourself, okay, what's the financial metric around that? What's the comparable either per unit metric around that? What am I getting for what I'm investing in that area? And I think the interesting thing is we started to benchmark these. They've changed. At one point, we'd talk about network in terms of what was my cost per port. Now we look at what is my network cost per employee, what is my cost per gigabit, because again, I can give you lower costs, but just like at home, or I guess mobile plan is a better example, and get the cheapest mobile plan. It's going to be great for my budget, but I'm going to blow through that data limit like it's nobody's business.
So I love the way you laid that out. And, I think something we're shared on too is that services view of benchmarks, as in, there's service categories when you break it down, like what you called out the network devices, for example, network end user devices. In my space, like it's things like, what does it cost to run a platform versus customizations, change management, governance. How do you divide all those different aspects? And even further, how do you run an organization? Like, what's your right ratios of, say, developers to project managers to product owners to folks that are business process transformation people? And I think it's that set of metrics that really, if you can strive for them, that takes you to a well-oiled machine as well, not just following blindly a benchmark. But I think the benchmarks are based and grounded in this wonderful reality that if you kind of look like this, you're most likely operating in the most optimum way. You're most likely operating in a way that is beneficial for the revenue size of the company or for the business unit you're supporting. And I think that's something we are so shared and aligned on as well.
Yes, and I think what's interesting about that is then you start to ask yourself, okay, I am optimized. What is the value that I'm delivering to the organization? I think now more than ever, CTOs, CIOs, CDIOs, whatever label you want to put on it, that is the critical role that we play within the organization. So then you can start to ask questions like, well, what is my technology cost for customer acquisition? What is my technology cost for bringing a dollar in through accounts receivable? And I think obviously we're on that journey here, but then you start to say, is it worth more if I invest more in order to accelerate that? And we started to talk about something called flow velocity within each of the business processes, understanding that each and every business process is going to be fully digital. How do we start to measure that and say that, yeah, I am going to start to invest more on the technology, and especially when we think about this AI journey that everyone's on, generative or not, I'm going to direct more dollars to the IT part of my portfolio and less for where maybe I had low-level people doing that, so that we can get higher scope people focusing on the more complex problems in those parts of the operation. And I think that's an interesting dynamic where you just take the basic benchmark, maybe not going to get there, but how do we pivot then to that value conversation?
Yeah, and I think one of the areas I'm incorporating in my organization and operating model is this concept of value realization, which is, it's kind of almost project management 101 in a lot of weird ways. It's, what is the value you set out to achieve? What was the scope within which you would achieve it? What is the cost of that? And then following up on the other end. And I think that's, where a lot of organizations kind of fall down, is that follow up at the end, because it's not so much, I think there's oftentimes a tendency to take the negative out of that, which is like, oh, well, this just didn't have value. This was a mistake. It's like, but what if you find that one thing that did drive revenue or productivity? That was the huge winner. And I think sometimes really, again, striving and focusing in and honing in on those really kind of helps you with those value determinations that are so important for the decision making.
Yeah, and it sounds like what you're getting at, and I think you kind of touched on it when you mentioned revenue in there. There are non-IT value drivers that I think you are setting up in your organization to be able to track. We said this was going to bring in X additional dollars of revenue. Is it actually doing that? How are you finding those conversations going when I think you and I kind of both grew up in a world where it's like, okay, it's an IT project, there's going to be some value, and then it's an IT expense. And to your point, we don't follow up on that. How has that conversation changed for you?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. It's changed tremendously, because I think, like you said, it was more, IT was seen as, well, go build me this, or I need this, I think a lot of times. And I think it's changing the conversation for the positive because we're seeing more and more that, as these large platforms, at least in my space, have evolved, they can do so much. And where we might want to build complexity into the system, oftentimes the answer is driving towards a more simple answer. The answer that drives the value is not like, hey, I need this tweak or customization. The value is in kind of getting back to the basics, getting back into, what does a sales cadence look like in the most basic sales way? What does it look like in the most simple way for a publicly traded company to close their books in an SEC approved way. So like, let's ask those, I'll call them the clean sheet questions, because, again, IBM is an incredibly complex company that has been built up over 100 years, more than 100 years. And, there's some bits of inertia, I think, as you go through transformation, and that the benchmarks and I think the operating model we're trying to put in place really kind of bring out.
I think inertia is a great way to describe that. As you pointed out, the company's not new. I think it's fun to compare with newer companies. I think you worked at some modern companies when you were
Some very new
on
companies,
your
yeah.
hiatus. And,
Yes.
I mean, what was that like? Kind of coming back in here? Like, did they? And I love that you brought some of that. And to be fair, like I'm 5 years in, I worked at a newer company as well, part of the Red Hat acquisition. But I imagine you're seeing some things too that, like, hey, this just isn't a good way to do that. How does that manifest with this value realization?
Well, I mean, again, I think there's this. I think there's this idea that you build for the corner cases. I think sometimes is a mistake we make in IT, and I think two of the companies I worked for on my hiatus from IBM, as you called it, were private equity owned, and you really see that that very simple HRIS implementation, for example, like, wait, that met the need. Wow, like we thought we needed these other things. And so I feel like the experience I'm bringing coming back for, I'll say, my second term at IBM is really the idea of, like, I've seen what the absolute min set is, and I've seen where IBM set and other large companies set is, neither is, I'll say neither is right or wrong, but it's like you recognize that there's this whole range of value and area to adapt within, I think, in both a large or a small company space. So
yeah, I think that's interesting because I reflect on some of my own experience early in my career during the dot-com bubble. I left the company I was working for. I went back because the company I worked for then subsequently folded. But I like to say I had the best learning experience from that in like the 10 months I was gone working for this small, rapidly paced startup than I had gotten in the 5 years before working for the company. And I think as you speak to those things, it's kind of reminding me of, getting these different experiences, getting different perspectives, and how critical that is for us to, again, if I'm running races or preparing for a marathon, I want to know like what good looks like. And I'm going to look at a bunch of different factors. I know I'm not going to be an Olympic athlete. I'm not very athletic. I'll start looking at things. What is my age group, my demographics? I'm reminded of this because I ran sort of an unprepared 5K on Thanksgiving Day.
Oh, you turkey trotted?
I did. I did.
That's great. I had no idea you turkey trotted.
This is the first one, to be fair, and I had not trained at all. So I'm still suffering almost a week later.
Oh, that's amazing. Come on, man. We're getting too old for that. No last minute races. No last minute races. So, Matt, jumping off on this idea of inertia that we just touched on, in the context of transformation, where do you see in your space inertia really having the biggest impact or playing the biggest role?
Well, I think I go back to my basic physics education, where inertia, if I remember, is things just want to stay the way that they are. And transforming obviously means we're driving a lot of change. And I think this is where, interestingly enough, the technology, I think, has matured enough to help us overcome inertia even more rapidly, whether that's the way that we objectively evaluate risk and the probability that some risk event will occur and become an issue versus, hey, I'm going to be super conservative and only focus on managing that risk, and I'm not going to do anything too dangerous, to now I can take tools that will help me automate things in new ways that really starts to get things off the ground. And this is where I've personally seen that if we can get our people to bite off on these concepts and take some risk around, hey, I want to try something out. I want to be a little scientist and run a little 2-week experiment to see what I'm going to get out of implementing this automation, or hey, let's put some generative AI or even traditional AI in this pocket of the operation. Our network operations, for example, we're doing some stuff within our devices telemetry. Started off as a mini experiment that now we're able to deploy and yielding significant results.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you touched on a really important point there, which was determining what the actual risk is. And I think begs the question, there's risk versus perceived risk. I think that can drive inertia as well. And, perceived risk is a tough thing as well. It's usually process change, people change. It is the kind of the comfort of this works, and sometimes more fear-driven than an actual value statement of risk.
Yes, and I think that's a human behavior. I always tell myself from an analytical perspective, really just to say, what's the probability that this event will happen? Sort of that if-then statement. If bad event happens, then here's the impact of that. You can say, well, what's the likelihood that that's going to happen over the course of the next 12 months? And if that does happen, what is the magnitude of that impact going to be? If you can get people to think on that way, then you're like, oh, okay. No, maybe this will happen once every 2, 3, 4 years, but it's certainly not going to happen in the next 6 months, or the probability is so low. And then we can plan around that as to, okay, if it did happen, what would the cost of that impact be, the magnitude of that, and then is what I'm trying to do more or less than that cost. It's a useful decision-making tool. But I think absolutely, and being able to manage risk more effectively in a fact-based way, using things like probabilities, using things like impact, helps you to overcome some of that organizational inertia that's otherwise going to leave you stagnant.
So I want to pivot. The title of this podcast is Transformers, and I think we are in these seats, being asked by our company to drive transformation, drive the way we want this company to change. We want to be, the world's leading AI and hybrid cloud company, and to get the company to where it is. And I think one thing besides benchmarks, we've also talked a lot about is like operating models, how we operate within the company, how we operate with our partners in the company, and maybe even in some cases, how we operate in like partnerships external to IBM. Would love your thoughts on how the operating model kind of plays into the transformation concept.
Yeah, I think it goes back. It's kind of interesting reflecting what you and I both did during our first year. I think you were pretty clear on the operating model and organizational structure that you, based on your experience, was going to be best to drive your strategic initiatives forward. I think I approached mine with a similar thesis. I would say, what is the outcome that I need to achieve at the velocity I need to do that? And so I always approach the operating model, and especially with building these technology platforms, and whether that's moving from an era where we were hands-on most of the stuff to now autonomous operations and things like that, I've got an outcome in mind. I've got to start with the outcome and then have a hypothesis about what is going to be the most effective operating model in order to do that. It's also grounded on some notion of best practices. And I think observing you from a side, that's what you tried to do in your part of the organization. That's what I've tried to do in mine. Interestingly enough, it looks quite different. I think you've adopted more of a product management approach. And looking from the outside, I would say, I think that's because you knew we need a structure to do the value realization and to capture the needs of the business. We need to understand the capabilities we're getting.
Treat IBM as the customer. Treat IBM as the customer. That's the cadence.
Yeah, exactly. All the way down to how you're delivering that. Mine, I've got smaller pockets. So I have a vertically integrated function for my network, for my devices, that's working just as effectively, but interesting, two different operating models that can coexist within that based on what do we have to get done now. And so I always look at it from the perspective of what do I got to get done in the next 12 months? And I'll have people come to me and say, oh, my last company, I did this org structure where 10 years ago, we did this org structure, was the best thing since sliced bread. And I asked the team, and this is usually when there's someone on the team who is angling for a promotion. What are you trying to accomplish? And then they can't answer. I'm like, let's settle on what it is that we're trying to accomplish. We have a set of OKRs. Then we can be clear on that. So again, I think the operating model is all anchored in that. And then we can look at what are others doing that may be of interest. What are they learning on their journey? What worked? What didn't work? What are the different dynamics through that? Was it a different set of outcomes that they were going for? Was there a different organizational culture that had them adopt the type of operating model that they did?
Yeah, no. I mean, absolutely. I love where you went with that answer. But Matt, as always, love talking to you. I know we talk to each other like probably on average 500 times a week and 100 times a day.
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
But thank you for taking the time out today to do this podcast, and, just love sharing your story. I love actually sharing what we do together. And, I think you've got some really fantastic stories, and love what you're doing with your team and how you're transforming and evolving. So thanks for your time today.
All right. Ditto, Ann. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining the very first episode of Transformers. We really hope you enjoyed it and got a peek into what it's like behind the scenes in the technology transformers life. We'll be back here every couple weeks and hope you'll join us.